Good afternoon, I'm Abe.
And I'm Frank. And today we will be adumbrating the first half of Chapter 3, Settling the Northern Colonies, in Kennedy, Cohen, and Bailey's The American Pageant textbook. So let's get started. Our story starts in 1517 with the Protestant reformer Martin Luther, who nailed his 95 Theses of the Catholic Reformation to the door of the Wittenberg Cathedral in 1517. And he had several ideas about how to reform the Catholic Church, but he didn't realize then that his ideas would snowball into becoming the Protestant Reformation, which then inspired a preacher named John Calvin, who preached under Calvinism. He stressed this theory of predestination, which said that those going to heaven or hell had already been determined by God, since God was all-knowing. The basic doctrine was stated in his 1536 document entitled The Institutes of the Christian Religion. It stated that only the predestined could go to heaven, no matter what. Calvinists were famous for working hard from dawn to dusk to prove their worthiness to God. The impact of Calvinism has been stamped onto the colonists of the early American continent, and they have been noted for their Protestant work ethic. In England, Henry VIII was breaking his ties with the Catholic Church, with the Holy Roman Catholic Church in the 1530s. And some people, called the Puritans, wanted to purify the Church of England completely of all of its Catholic elements and make it completely Protestant. The Puritans were separatists who vowed to break away from the Church of England, aka the Anglican Church, because they thought that it incorporated too many Catholic elements. King James I therefore decided that the separatists had to go, since they were threatening not only his religious authority, but his political authority as well. These people would become the forerunners of the Pilgrims. Abe, can you elaborate on those Pilgrims?
Yes, so the Pilgrims, or also known as the Separatists, came originally from Holland, where they had fled after they had left England. So basically, they did want a place where they were free to worship their own religion and could live and die as good pilgrims, so they looked to the Americas for this. They negotiated with the Virginia Company, and the Separatists therefore left Holland. They embarked on the Mayflower, and less than half of the Pilgrims on the Mayflower, interestingly, were actually Separatists. The Pilgrims were squatters. They were people without legal rights to the land and without specific authority to establish the government, as we previously mentioned. One of the non-separatists on board was Captain Miles Standish, also known as Captain Shrimp. Doesn't shrimp sound really good right now?
Shut up.
Anyways, he proved to be a great Indian fighter and negotiator. Before leaving the ship, the Pilgrims signed the Mayflower Compact, which is basically a set of rules of which to obey. It did set the standard for later constitutions, but it was not a constitution itself. It set the first step towards self-rule in the northern colonies. The Pilgrims' first winter, the winter of 1620 to 1621, only 44 of the 102 survived. 1621, however, did bring bountiful harvests, and the first Thanksgiving was celebrated that year. There were two important things to the Pilgrims, beavers and the Bible. Beavers were eaten profusely, and the Bible was kept nearby for nourishment of the soul. William Bradford was chosen the governor of Plymouth, and he was a great leader. He could read Latin, that's obviously why, and he helped Plymouth to survive and trade fur, fish, and lumber. In 1691, Plymouth as we know it finally merged with the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and we no longer have Plymouth. So, Frank, could you tell me, did any settlers follow in the footsteps of the Pilgrims?
Absolutely. In 1629, some non-separatist Puritans got a royal charter from England to settle in the New World. Secretly, they took the charter with them and later used it as a type of constitution, similar to what the Pilgrims did with the Mayflower Compact. The Massachusetts Bay Colony was well-equipped, far more well-equipped than the Pilgrims, and it had 11 ships which carried 1,000 people each to Massachusetts. And this is one of the reasons that, during the Great Migration, many settlers chose to come to Massachusetts as opposed to the plantation colonies in the South. One of the key figures of the time was John Winthrop, who was elected governor or deputy governor for a total of 19 years, and he helped Massachusetts prosper in fur trading, fishing, and shipbuilding. But tell me, Abe, how did the Puritan Society develop after it initially started in 1629?
Okay, so soon after the establishment of the colony, the franchise, or the right to vote, was extended to all freedmen.
Good.
But freedmen were only adult males who belonged to the Puritan congregations.
Not good.
Or the Congregational Church. This made people who could use the franchise to be about 2/5 of the male population. Unchurched men and women remained voteless. The provincial government also was not a democracy. Governor Winthrop feared and distrusted the common people, and he called the democracy the meanest and worst of all forms of government. Religious leaders wielded powerful influence over the government and the admission to church membership. John Cotton, a prominent clergy member, defended the government's duty to enforce religious rules. The Bay colonists endorsed the idea of the separation of church and state. Because the congregations could still hire and fire their ministers at will.
I see.
There were also laws. They passed laws to make sure that worldly pleasures were limited and stayed kind of inactive and dormant. There was a fine for 20 shillings for couples caught kissing in public. And lastly, the Puritan concept of hell was very serious, frightening, and very real, as exemplified by Michael Wigglesworth's poem, Day of Doom.
So a very, really religious society.
Exactly, yes.
So in this religious society, one would expect to find a certain amount of strife and conflict between the different religious orders. And indeed, that's what ended up happening. Tensions began to rise in Massachusetts, with Quakers being fined, flogged, and banished. Anne Hutchinson is a great and classic example. She was an intelligent, strong-willed, and talkative woman who claimed that the holy life was no sure sign of salvation, and that the truly saved need not bother obey the law of either God or man. This notion became known as anti-nominalism. She was brought to trial for these views in 1638, but Anne simply boasted that her beliefs came directly from God. She was then banished from the colony of Massachusetts and eventually made her way to Rhode Island. However, years later, she was killed during an Indian raid in New York. Another classic example of a separatist is Roger Williams. He was a radical idealist who hounded his fellow clergymen to make a clean and complete break with the Church of England. He went on to deny that civil government could and should govern religious behavior, saying that they should be separate entirely. He was banished from Massachusetts in 1635, and then led the way for the Rhode Island colony. So, Abe, I noticed that Anne Hutchinson fled to Rhode Island. Why was this?
Yeah, so it was because Rhode Island was a very unique colony. Roger Williams, governor of Rhode Island, endorsed freedom of religion, making Rhode Island the most liberal out of any other English settlement. People who went to Rhode Island weren't necessarily similar. They were just unwanted everywhere else, such as Anne Hutchinson. They were also against special privileges, and therefore Rhode Island enjoyed remarkable freedom of opportunity. Little Rhodey was later known as the traditional home of the otherwise minded, as just exemplifying what I said above.
Yeah.
It finally secured a charter in 1604, which gave it rights to the soil. So, Frank, tell me about how the colonists settled in the New England area.
Absolutely. So as more and more settlers arrived, they began to branch out and conquer new land. So in 1635, Connecticut is founded to the south of Massachusetts. Then Reverend Thomas Hooker led an energetic group of Puritans west into Connecticut. And in 1639, settlers of the new Connecticut River colony drafted in open meeting a trailblazing document called the Fundamental Orders. And it was basically the preface of a modern constitution, even more so than the Mayflower Compact, or the charter of the Massachusetts colony. So, in 1638, New Haven was founded and eventually merged into Connecticut. So these small settlements are getting bigger and bigger as more and more people arrive and as more and more land is conquered from the Native Americans. In 1623, Maine was absorbed by Massachusetts and remained so for nearly a century and a half. In 1641, New Hampshire was absorbed into Massachusetts, and in 1679, the king separated the two and made New Hampshire into a royal colony. So prior to that, we'd seen that Massachusetts was growing and growing, absorbing first Maine and then New Hampshire, but then the king stepped in and separated them again. But Abe, tell me, as these colonies, as these settlements continued to grow, was there more and more friction with the Native Americans?
Yes, so before the Puritans had arrived in 1620, there was an epidemic, of course, that swept through the Indians and killed over three-fourths of them. These poor Indians. At first, the Indians tried to befriend the whites. Squanto, the acclaimed Wampanoag, helped keep relative peace. He had learned English. In 1637, though, after there were lots of mounting tensions that had finally exploded, the English settlers and the powerful Pequot tribe fought in what we know as the Pequot War. In the Pequot War, the English set fire to the Pequot village and annihilated the Indians, and it brought about 40 years of tentative peace. The Puritans did try to convert some of the Indians, though with less zeal than the Spanish and French had done previously. In 1675, Metacom, who was called King Philip by the English, united these neighboring Indians in a lasting ditched attack that failed. Metacom was the son of the previous Wampanoag leader. King Philip's War, the effects were that they slowed down the colonial western march, but Metacom was eventually defeated, and the colonists were successful.
So the general trend we're seeing here is that though there's coordinated Indian resistance, because of the disease and then the superior European technology, they're not being successful.
Yes, the Indians are consistently defeated.
I see. So that's the end of part 1. Make sure to tune in for part 2, and please like, comment, and subscribe.
Catch you guys next time.